in Great Britain, then there is so much more now. Probably isn't enough, but there's so much more recovery resource than there used to be, and people can access it. And often those those recovery sources are not kind of professional services; they're social spaces and their friendship groups, and so that kind of emphasis away from the idea that, I mean, Bill White expressed it. He said in 2006, there is a paradigm shift going on in the addiction world. And that paradigm shift is from a pathology and intervention paradigm. In other words, a quasi-medical model that there's something wrong with people and you intervene on them in order to kind of correct the disorder. And that, he said, that's sort of disappearing, although he gave reasons why it wouldn't disappear altogether. And it's moving to a recovery management paradigm where the job of professionals is to, help introduce people to recovery resources, help them make connections, help them do the things they need to do to kind of, reclaim power over their lives, to mend relationships, to build meaning into their lives, build hope, all of those things. And I think that's really important. I mean, he wrote that in 2005 or 6, and it's taken till 2023 before you really see much of a change. And there's still people not taking that on board, still very much clinging to the old paradigm.
Yeah, and I still, I still hear occasional references to, lived experience recovery organisations from, and I wouldn't call them exclusively medical, but predominantly medical professional organisations that will suggest that the collective body of that lived experience organisation don't know what they're doing. There is this.
Well, yes, I mean, clearly there will be some protectionism. I think, it's important not to be kind of conspiracy theorist about this.
Yes.
I mean, there is, medical people do have an enormous body of knowledge that's not actually normally accessible to people who aren't medically trained, and they kind of do understand some things, and they, but they again tend to, like many very trained up professionals, have that rather narrow purview. They have a model of things within that particular frame, and to understand that maybe actually there's another frame to look at things through is difficult for some people. I mean, the opposite is also true. I mean, you can't imagine more supportive people to recovery than someone like Griff Edwards, who was a doctor, a psychiatrist. He supported both AA and therapeutic communities.
No, of course, and one of the people we've done very early in this series, of course, is David McCartney, of course.
Yeah, I mean, lots of them. I mean, David, especially nowadays, but also, people like Max Glatt, who kind of set up the first kind of proper, effective alcohol units in the country. So the idea that doctors and psychologists and other professionals are somehow all blinkered and don't have the recovery vision, it's not true. But in some ways they need to see it and be introduced to it and to begin to understand it, or be part of it themselves. I mean, I think some people who are themselves in recovery and are doctors, do a lot of good in terms of helping people to understand this.
There's something in all of this about where you started, about when you were talking about that new directions and it opening it up. I suppose, what we're talking about is just wanting more and more connectivity and or seamlessness between what at one point in time were very polarized worlds. So, you want a clinical and or recovery world for want of better words, that are just much better next to each other, so the individual can wander from one to the other, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people will continue to need medical services and psychological services and social services.
Of course.
And the recovery community is not this sort of utopian perfection, and it never will be. No matter how much it develops and how strong it gets and how easy it becomes to access it. I mean, the kind of sociological term for the ability of people to access these services and the provision of these resources in the community is capital, social capital. Yes. And it isn't the only part. I mean, what's really been important, although recovery capital is now a huge sort of buzzword, and there's going to be a very important reader being published, a kind of multi-author book about recovery capital, which will come out fairly soon. It isn't the whole picture. There is, as Bill White has said, as he says about everything, there's it's a two-factor thing. There's the severity of the addiction itself, which is often physiological. People have strong cravings. They have perhaps an organic need for drugs at certain times of their life. There's the power of that, and also there's the social recovery capital aspect to it, and both of them need to be taken into account. There are people who've got loads of social capital who go under and die because their addiction is just very, very, very powerful. And there are folk who have no recovery capital who manage to sustain recovery. So there's no magic book about it. And actually, there's the kind of doctors that I like reading are those doctors who also see medicine as a sort of socially situated practice. Of course, there's a lot of science and there's a lot of kind of reality-based stuff going on. And like you say, if you want to be treated for diabetes or you want to have an operation, you want to make sure that the person doing that knows what they're about.
Yeah, I've had two mates in the last 3 months who have both had open heart surgery. You want someone who really knows what you want. You want it right.
This is not this is not constructionism. It's about reality, and we need that.
Of course.
But we also need this cultural, social understanding of recovery and the fact that addiction is also created by and sustained by social, cultural factors, that there are societies where addiction was practically unknown. And there are societies where addiction wreaks particular havoc. And it seems like the United States would be a very good example of that. And why that happens in some countries and quite dramatically differently from most European countries. So, for example, just the diagnosis of alcohol dependence is wildly bigger in America than it is, say, in the Netherlands. And that isn't down to just diagnosis practices. It's clearly alcohol dependence is a much bigger thing, a much bigger phenomenon in American society than it is in Dutch. And it's not fixed. We know, for example, that French drinking has changed vastly since the 50s to now. So all of these kind of cultural factors drive particular kinds of addiction. The person that really noticed that to start off with was Jelinek, who defined these different types of alcoholism based on his studies of different cultures and different societies and the way they express their alcohol problems differently, and the way people accept or don't accept drink. A lot of countries where there is a very serious addiction problem have very ambivalent views on alcohol use. The idea that for example, somebody would drink some alcohol every day of their lives, of their adult lives, and that's perfectly normal and acceptable. Very few Americans would agree with that. They'd say, if someone drinks alcohol every day, there's sort of something wrong. And I'm not entirely sure where that comes from. The history of attitudes to alcohol in America, very interesting story. Certainly, the early pilgrims and the immigrants that came at that time rather celebrated alcohol and thought it was rather a good thing, and God's good bounty and stuff. So, where this kind of fear of alcohol came from, it's something to do with religion and culture. It's interesting that New Zealand, which again, the white community in New Zealand comes from Protestant, Scottish, Scot.
Yep.
That's obviously a huge generalisation, but that's very, very strong. You have sheep farmer in Invercargill is probably Scots, probably called MacDonald or something, and they're Protestant Christians. And on the New Zealand general election ballot, when they're electing a government, until very recently, I think it's just been removed, but do you vote that New Zealand goes alcohol free, prohibition? So there's something to do with Protestantism and prohibition that's kind of interesting. I'm not enough of a historian to know how valid those arguments are, but that kind of thing really interests me.